The educational goals of Nigeria have been spelled out in the document National Policy on Education and Forms of Educational Services. Broadly, the goal is the equipment of all Nigerians with essential skill and knowledge useful to them as individuals and members of the community. To these skills are to be added the cultivation of ethical behavior, standards and values. It is therefore the scope of this documentary to discuss the extent to which the nation's educational programs have met the stated objectives of the national policy on education. Attention was focused only on a few key issues, and the documentary presented a state-of-the-art review of each issue. Efforts were also made to identify the impact of various important factors on the implementation processes. Every society, whether simple or complex, has its own system for training and educating its youth. And education for the good life has been one of the most persistent concerns of men throughout history. However, the goal of education and the method of approach may differ from place to place, nation to nation, and people to people. The book on the history of West Africa since 1800, written by Elizabeth Isseche, claimed that in old Africa, the warrior, the hunter, the nobleman, the man of character, or anyone who combined the latter feature with a specific skill was adjudged to be a well-educated and well-integrated citizen of his community. In the old Nigerian society, the purpose of traditional education was clear. Functionalism was the main guiding principle. Although Nigeria consists of many ethnic groups and societies, each its own culture and tradition, they all have common educational aims and objectives. But methods differ from place to place chiefly because of socio, economic and geographical imperatives. According to Babs Fafnwa's book on the history of education in Nigeria, the Nigerian society regarded traditional education as a means to an end and not as an end in itself. Traditional education was generally for an immediate induction into society and a preparation for adulthood. In particular, Nigerian traditional education emphasized social responsibility, job orientation, political participation, and spiritual and moral values. The coming of Muslim traders and teachers to the northern parts of Nigeria from about the 15th century accelerated the pace of change, for literacy was introduced and the Quran launched. The Portuguese priest during the same century also introduced into the coastal areas of southern Nigeria literacy and the Catholic religion. Both pioneers of literacy were accompanied by slave dealers and traders. From the 19th century, Christian missionaries intensified their educational efforts, while the Muslim Caliphate of northern Nigeria, established after the Jihad Holy Word of Usman Dan Fodio, consolidated Islamic education efforts. Quranic schools were thus introduced with the recitation of chapters of the Quran and the use of whip, a form of corporal punishment. The Nigerian education system, written by Chief C.O. Taiwo, claimed in his book that it was the Christian missionaries from Sierra Leone, England, Ireland, Scotland, Paris, Rome and the United States who laid the foundation of Western education in Nigeria. First, the Church Missionary Society established schools in Badagry and Lagos from 1842, followed by the Methodist Mission. Among both missions, the hinterland of Yoruba land was penetrated and schools founded in Lagos, Awokoya and Ibadan by 1853. The Roman Catholic Mission followed in 1868, while Baptists of the United States joined in the religious scramble of Nigeria. Nigeria could be said to have practiced two systems of education before the advent of the school education in the real sense of the word school. The basic aims of the Muslim and traditional education could be seen as the transmission of the cultural heritage of the people and the preparation of the young ones in each community for a useful adult life, usually not different from the traditional family roles. Whether we think of Muslim or traditional education, the advent of the British colonial administration had a significant impact on the direction of the Nigerian school education. As a result of the European missionaries in Nigeria, British administration was established in Lagos in 1861 and extended to Ibadan in 1893 and to northern Nigeria in 1903. Through a series of military expeditions, Nigerians were forced under colonial regime. The education work of the missionaries was thenceforth subject to ordinances promulgated by government and supervision and control of government agencies. The colonial administration also decided the content of instruction. One of the primary schools that was founded during the colonial rule was the Holy Trinity Catholic Primary School, which was established almost simultaneously with Holy Trinity Catholic Church in 1914 at Awa, Ilaporu, Ogun State. Reverend Father Thomas Carneil, who had arrived in Nigeria since 1958, is one of the priests in the church. He traced the historical background surrounding the establishment of his church and school and the subsequent changes that followed as a result of the colonial rule and the post-independent governments of Nigeria.
Originally it was with the help of the people that the school was started, and money for the running of the school came from the mission and from the people. And then the big development in all the primary schools here was, of course, when we got grants for building classrooms. Chief Awo, during that time in the middle 1950s, I think it was, we got grants for building classrooms. I think it was £200 we got for each classroom to build it and to equip it. At that time,
who gave you this grant?
This was government grant. Chief Awolo was responsible, I think, for that. That brought a big mushroom development in the primary schools all over the area. So this school would have benefited from that also. But during that time, the mission worked in hand with the government. We tried to keep the standards laid down by government so that we would qualify for the grants for salaries for the teachers. And then, of course, the more recent movement is when the full running of the school, the money and appointment of teachers, the day-to-day running of the school was taken over completely by the government, and we moved into the background. So that today, really, in effect, all it means is that the school is Catholic in name. We don't appoint the teachers. We have very few Catholic teachers in any of our schools, and even less Catholic headmasters. So we have really almost no influence in the Catholic schools in this area today, as I see it.
Above all considerations, the colonial administration was anxious to have a cream of educated elite capable of servicing the colonial machinery. Thus, science and technology were not developed in schools, and so the post-secondary schools were not founded. Thus, mass education was not attempted, and the Nigerian masses were left unlettered, and therefore, graduates of the various institutions in Nigeria were not qualified for the position of civil servants or higher professionals, but were employed as assistant engineers, assistant surgeons, and assistant surveyors. A change in colonial policy led to a more liberal attitude in Britain in the 1940s. A university college was therefore founded at Ibadan in 1948, and mass literacy campaigns were established in parts of the country. Government began to appear more alive to its responsibility in the area of education. When colonial administration subsided and Nigerian leaders began to take over educational control, first, the governments of eastern and western regions decided to launch a universal primary education for children aged 6. Both governments also decided to embark on the development of higher education in the regions. The federal government joined in a new educational offensive when it instituted in April 1959 a commission to conduct an investigation into Nigeria's needs in the fields of post-secondary school certificate and higher education over the next 20 years, 1960 to 1980. The commission was headed by Sir Eric Ashby of Cambridge University, and it reported in October 1960. In addition to the expansion of schools and universities, the issue of appropriate curriculum was at the heart of the Nigerian leaders. The Nigerian languages acquired a new status and were no longer derived in schools. Economics, education, law, business administration and technology were given attention, and agriculture emphasized. To train middle-level manpower, Polytechnics and technical colleges have been founded. Colleges of education have sprung up as centers for training teachers. The phenomenal increase in the population, size and complexity of the school systems during the era of the military rule between 1966 and 1979 led to a reappraisal of the administrative structure of Nigeria's educational system. The federal and state ministries of education took over the responsibility of putting up a draft for a national policy on education. The history of the new policy dates back to the National Curriculum Conference held in September 1969, during which Nigerians from all walks of life were invited to present their views on what kind of education they wanted for Nigeria. That conference was organized by the Nigeria Educational Research Council, which was then a unit in the Federal Ministry of Education. 4 years later, in 1973, a national seminar was called under the chairmanship of Chief S.O. Adebo to prepare the draft of national policy on education based on the recommendations of the 1969 Curriculum Conference. From the report of the seminar, the federal government finally brought out the document Federal Republic of Nigeria National Policy on Education in 1977. This was asserted by Professor E.A. Yoloye in his paper entitled Trends and Issues in Contemporary Nigerian Education, a paper which was prepared for the African Curriculum Organization on the aspect of education and curriculum development in Nigeria, March 1983. Professor Yoloye claimed that in 1977, an implementation committee was set up under the chairmanship of Professor S.D. Onabamiro to prepare a blueprint for the implementation of the policy. The committee submitted its report in 1978. Also, federal government reactions were published the following year, he added. With the coming of civilian regime in 1979, there was a number of modifications in the policy. Thus, a revised edition of the policy came out in 1981, but the essential spirit of it has remained. The national policy document deals with 11 aspects of education in the country. These are philosophy of education, pre-primary education, primary education, secondary education, teacher education, higher education, technical education, adult and non-formal education, special education, educational services, educational planning, organization and financing. Although the implementation committee did not submit its report till 1978, implementation of parts of the policy had started since 1976. In discussing the current state of the art in the implementation of the policy, three main important factors must be considered. They are the political context, the economic context, and the social context. The political context showed that the entire history of the formulation of the policy took place during the military regime between January 1966 to September 1979. The implementation of the major part of the policy, however, took place during the civilian regime from October 1979 to December 1983. Professor Yoloye wrote that during the military regime, power was highly centralized, and although Nigeria still operated as a federation, each state was subject to directives of the federal government, he claimed. The military owed no allegiance to any electorate. Although partisan pressures still operated in a military regime, the dimensions of such pressures were small compared with what took place in civilian regime. The federal government held the purse strings, but each state government has considerable liberty to formulate its own educational policies and establish its own institutions with little interference from the federal government. The result of this situation is that several things are taking place in the educational system of the states which are not specified in the national policy. The prime example is the defunct UPN control states, which operated free secondary education with 100% transition from primary to secondary school since 1979, while the national policy envisaged 40% transition to junior secondary schools with effect from 1982. Another factor affecting the implementation of the policy is the economic context. The seminar that provided the framework for the national policy took place in 1973. 1973 and 1974 were the year of the oil boom in Nigeria, a time when Nigeria felt so rich that it believed the sky was the limit to what it could do. For those drafting the policy, therefore, economic considerations were not serious constraints. For the same reason, some other significant events took place in the society which were destined to influence the economic future of the country. The most significant was the Udoji salary review, which not only raised salary levels considerably, but paid close to a year's arrears. Conditions of service became generous to the extent that many grade 2 primary school teachers were entitled to vehicle advance and retirement benefits. It became so attractive that many able-bodied people were happy to retire early and take fresh jobs. Significant also was the number of construction projects that were embarked upon at inflated prices. By the time the final policy document came out in 1977, the economic recession had begun and has been deteriorating ever since. By 1982, when the new educational structure was expected to come into effect, Nigeria was already in deep financial trouble. A retired educationist, Professor Awokoya, said that besides the economic and socio-political context, the community aspect must also be viewed with all seriousness.
In Kwara State, for instance, I know that sometimes even before the first military regime and during the earlier part of the first military regime, people in Kwara State were paying the highest amount for primary and secondary education in Nigeria, paying more than any other. So that place, even though it's a sort of transition area between the south and the north, they valued education a great deal in Kwara State. And they were prepared to accept a great deal of responsibility. But not the same in Sokoto. Sokoto had the lowest enrollment in Nigeria for very many years. And anybody going to push universal primary education in Sokoto, for instance, must first of all start intense propaganda among the community so that they accept the situation. Because without this community acceptance, it doesn't matter how much money you pour into any social scheme. It's like pouring treasures into a barrel without a bottom.
The third factor affecting the implementation of the policy is the social context. One of the issues highlighted by the Nigerian crisis and subsequent civil war in the last 4 years of the 60s was the so-called educational imbalance between different sections of the country. It was generally felt that for social equity, the educational gap must be bridged somehow. The concept of the quota system in education became very typical in the military era, and this generated intense debates. The quota system constantly lost the battle, but eventually won the war because whether we admit it or not, it is operating throughout the country in various forms. The high social demand for access to education, especially higher education, has led to some serious concern in the so-called educationally advanced states. With the return to civilian rule in 1979 and the provision of the Constitution which puts higher education on the concurrent list, many of the state governments have taken steps to expand their higher education, facilities of colleges of education, polytechnics and universities to counter some of the adverse effects of the quota system. Thus, there has been an explosion in the provision of institutions of higher education in the country. Professor E.A. Yoloye of the Faculty of Education, University of Ibadan, had more on this.
There are many things in the social context that affected the policy, but it's really a mixture of both social and political. Now, the demand for education in different parts of the country differed. Now, in areas like the southern states where the demand for education is pretty high, there was a fear that qualified candidates from these areas might not get equal opportunities of admission, even though they may be qualified. And I think that is one of the reasons why there was this stampede for creation of new universities, state universities so as to cater for children in particular states, private universities also to cater for the large number of people who are wanting education in those areas. So the social context really deals with the social demands by the people in the particular areas. And again, this went very much against the requirements of the policy.
From the historical review that preceded, it is obvious that a number of educational issues require close examination. They are the Universal Primary Education Program, the new 6334 structure of education, teacher education, expansion of higher education, science and technology, continuous assessment. The Universal Primary Education Program began in 1976 in anticipation of the national policy, which came a year later. The first products of the program therefore came out in 1982. As of now, the program may be regarded as having reached a certain level of stability in terms of physical infrastructure in some states, but not all. Indeed, by the time of the introduction of UPE in 1976, a number of states had already achieved nearly 100% enrollment of school-age children in primary school. These states are Anambra, Bendel, Cross River, Imo, Lagos, Ogun, and Rivers. Ondo and Gongola had between 80% and 99%. All the other extreme were Kano and Sokoto with less than 19%, and Kaduna and Niger with between 20% and 39%. Three kinds of problems have arisen from the implementation of UPE, namely the financial burden, the lowering of educational standards, the dilemma of how to utilize the products of the scheme. In the absence of complete information on all states, a case study of Oyo State may provide some useful guidelines. The pattern of recurrent and capital expenditures on the 6 years, 1972 to 1978, showed that in absolute cost, recurrent expenditures rose from approximately 10.7 million naira in 1972-73 to 45.9 million naira in 1977-78, while capital rose from 27.9 thousand naira in 1972-73 to 5.1 million naira in 1977-78. The sudden upsurge in 1976-77 indicates the additional expenditures on buildings. Even by 1977-78, this was beginning to fall. A further insight into the financial problem can be gained by considering the components of recurrent expenditure as shown here. When the program stabilized, salaries alone accounted for between 96 and 97% of all recurrent expenditure. These figures provide proof of the financial burden brought by education in the difficulties which many states have had in paying the salaries of teachers. The researcher therefore acknowledged that Oyo, Lagos and Ogun states were the only states that have succeeded in overcoming the salary problem so far. The national policy on education requires 40% transition rate from primary to junior secondary school. There is therefore 60% that has to be catered for in some other way. In the 5 states of Lagos, Bendel, Ogun, Oyo and Ondo, which has already implemented 100% transition, the problem does not exist at this level. It is postponed till the end of secondary school. The problem is, however, likely to be an important one in the other states. The major change in secondary education is the introduction of the 6334 structure. In other words, 6 years primary education, 3 years junior secondary, 3 years senior secondary, 4 years university for a bachelor's degree. Although the first degrees in the universities are not all of 4 years duration, the 4 refers to those degrees which currently last 3 years. What is significant about the change is not just the structure, but the content of education, particularly at the junior and senior secondary schools. While the junior secondary school is expected to be both pre-vocational and academic, the senior secondary school is expected to be comprehensive in its curriculum. Of the two levels of secondary school, the one requiring the most major changes in content of instruction is the junior secondary. The following content recommended by the implementation committee in the core subjects are mathematics, English, 2 Nigerian languages, science, social studies, art and music, moral and religious instruction, physical education, and vocational subjects, while the content of the pre-vocational subjects include woodwork, metalwork, electronics, mechanics, local crafts, home economics, and business studies. The cost implications of this curriculum are related to the need for completely new human and material resources for the pre-vocational subjects. The implementation committee estimates that based on an expected 40% transition, the following finance in million naira will be required for each state for junior secondary schools in the first 3-year period. The total estimates for all the 19 states of the Federation is 1.2 billion naira. All financial calculation and costing were at 1978 basis. So in utilizing information contained in the blueprint, one has to consider the factor of inflation over a period of 5 years. In addition, existing secondary schools with forms 1 to 3 will need additional facilities for pre-vocational instruction. Over and above the infrastructural facilities, one must also think of the increased expenditure on the teacher salaries. The dimensions of the problem will vary from state to state. In the defunct 5 UPN control states of the 1979 to 1983 civilian regime, which already achieved 100% transition to secondary school, the projected requirement must necessarily be higher than that envisaged by the implementation committee. However, since these states have presumably taken care of most of the infrastructural facilities, their needs may be more in the direction of providing the special facilities for the pre-vocational subjects. In the other states, the problems will include the provision of basic infrastructural facilities. If the economic recession worsens to the extent that the states cannot find these additional funds, the new policy in respect of secondary schools may turn out to be a non-starter. One other financial implication of the implementation of the policy is that because of the need to recruit many secondary school teachers quickly, many states have to depend on expatriate teachers. With the advent of military government of General Buhari's administration in 1984 and their directive on aliens, many schools in some of these states with free secondary school education will be on the verge of collapse because of the high proportion of expatriate staff. Yet, continued retention of such high numbers of expatriate staff would constitute a great drain on the country's foreign exchange. Professor Awokoya explained more on this.
Now, first of all, about expatriate teachers. Undoubtedly, is a drain on our foreign exchange. But what is more serious is that the expatriate teachers have invariably not been properly chosen. They are the people that the countries could spare. They don't spare us their best. There are quite a number of Nigerians who are at least equally good and some better. And our system of recruitment of Nigerians is very, very poor. So the less we depend on expatriate teachers, we really ought to be self-reliant in these matters, the better for the country.
With the rapid expansion of secondary education in some states, there has been a fantastic rush to expand facilities for training NCE secondary school teachers. The multi-campus technique became very much the order of the day. Alarmed by the financial implications of this unprecedented expansion, the federal government of the defunct civilian administration unceremoniously withdrew from the provision of bursaries for teachers in training, with resulting increase in the financial burdens of the states concerned, asserted to Yoloye. A further trend in teacher education, especially of secondary school teachers, is the introduction of Bachelor of Education programs into colleges of education. At least 6 colleges of education now offer BEd programs. The indications are that in the near future, BEd programs will be predominantly located in these colleges of education. The development of universities in Nigeria came in the wake of Asquith Commission and the Elliott Commission both in 1943. In 1948, the University College Ibadan was established as a University College of London and continued in these states till 1963, when it became a full-fledged university and was renamed the University of Ibadan. The University of Nigeria, Nsukka, patterned after the land-grant University of the United States of America, was established in October 1961 as a full university awarding its own degrees. The initiative for its establishment came from the then government of Eastern Nigeria. The next three universities, all established in October 1962, were outcomes of the Ashby Commission report of 1960. These were Ahmadu Bello University, Zaria, the University of Lagos, and the University of Ife. At this time, Nigeria consisted politically of three regions: North, East and West, on the Federal Territory of Lagos. What in effect had happened was that in addition to the University College Ibadan, each of the political units now had a university. Subsequently, increases in the number of universities in the country have followed closely increases in the number of political units created. Thus, in 1967, Nigeria was reconstructed into 12 states instead of 4. By 1976, the number of universities had increased to 13. In 1976, Nigeria was again reconstituted into 19 states instead of 12. Another significant political event was the return of the country to civilian rule in 1979 after 13 years, that is 1966 to 1979, of military rule. The suspended constitution of that defunct civilian administration enabled both the federal and state governments to create universities. One outcome of these changes is that since 1979, several new universities, both federal and state, have come into existence. As at the time of this documentary, the count stood at 25. In addition, the approval of the proposed Open University will bring the number to 26. The National Policy on Education document 1981 defines secondary education as the form of education children receive after primary education and toward the tertiary stage. It states further that secondary education should be of 6-year duration and be given in 2 stages: a junior secondary school stage and a senior secondary school stage, each being of 3-year duration. At present, we should have a combination of the old 5-2 secondary system and the new 3-3 system operating in our schools. By 1987, however, the old system should have been completely phased out. In reality, the 3-3 system cannot be said to have taken off in most states, and unless something spectacular is done by the federal government in the near future, we are likely to still have the old system with us well after 1987. Nevertheless, the new policy is what is recognized now. This discussion of funding of secondary education will be based on the planned 3-3 structure. The 3-paragraph section on financing of education in the national policy says that the ultimate objective of government is to make education free at all levels. It further makes the financing of education a joint responsibility of the federal, state and local governments. Government, however, welcomes and encourages the participation of local communities, individuals and other organizations. But what the policy failed to do was to define explicitly free education. Consequently, there have been considerable variation in the meanings put on the term free education by different political parties, government functionaries, students and the general public. Thus, some of the outstate governments offer to provide free tuition as well as free books and writing materials. Students and the public at large often expect bursaries and subsidized feeding and housing as part of the free education package. One gubernatorial candidate during the 1983 electioneering campaigns even promised school uniforms and midday meals as part of the free education package. The Onabamiro Committee on Alternative Sources of Funding Education considered that free education should mean that the child is provided with whatever he would not have needed if he did not have to go to school. This definition would exclude housing and feeding, but would include books, writing materials, and transportation. Professor S.D. Onabamiro, the chairman of the Implementation Committee on the National Policy on Education, with his office based at the Federal Ministry of Education in Lagos, explained more on this.
Take primary education, for instance. It is specifically stated that primary education should be free as from September 1976 when it started. All right? The next level is secondary education, junior secondary and senior secondary. And again is stated, and if you have a copy, you can see the chapter and verse, that secondary education would be free when practicable. They didn't say free now. Would be or should be free when practicable. All right. We now go to the third level of education, tertiary. That is university. Should university education be free or not? Well, the answer to that is contained in the blueprint which the Implementation Committee for the National Policy on Education formulated and submitted to the then Federal Military Government of in 1979, defining what free university education should be. It should be 1, no payment of tuition fees to be demanded from students. 2, students should not be asked to pay for examination fees. 3, students should not be required to pay for instructional materials, like for instance the students who are doing chemistry, they need chemicals and apparatus, where the federal government or whoever is running the institution should provide all the requirements of the institution. Those are the 3 aspects which should be free. Then the document goes further to say the following should not be free. Food and lodging, the students should, all their sponsors should pay. Then the books, personal books, textbooks, the students should pay.
But Professor E.A. Yoloye of the Faculty of Education, University of Ibadan, attempted to define free education as he understands it.
Free education, basically, if I were to give a basic definition for it, should mean that no student should have to pay tuition fees because he's going to school. In other words, other expenses like feeding, housing, books and things should rightly be borne by the students' parents or guardians or whoever is responsible. Free tuition is what basically is meant by free education.
Then how would you define free education from mass education?
Well, mass education means that that's dealing with numbers, really, that you're taking a large number of people and giving them education. Free education means that whoever is in school does not have to pay tuition. It doesn't have to be everybody. I mean, that's a different policy, whether it is universal or not. Free education can be free but not universal. It can still be selective. On the other hand, it may be free and universal at the same time. In some places, it's also compulsory as well. So the freeness of it simply refers to non-payment of tuition fees. Now, as to how free it can get, I think the basic, there's an ideological factor in this. The basic philosophy behind free education is an attempt to equalize opportunities for all sections of the community. In other words, children from poor families should not be deprived of education simply because their parents cannot afford it. And that is why the concept of free education is put across. But such free education is free only to those students. Somebody else has to pay for it. So it doesn't mean that money is not spent on education. It has to be spent. And the question of who makes it free really depends on who is in a position to collect money from all and sundry and redistribute it so that even those who had not the ability to contribute a lot still benefit from it. And this is the concept of free education.
And how do others define free education? Professor A.D. Olutola of the University of Ilorin had this to say.
The whole idea, the whole philosophy behind free education is to give every child equal access to education. This is to say that no child is denied opportunity for education even when it cannot contribute directly to the cost. Of course, we do know that except air, nothing is really free. Somebody has to pay for services. And in this case, we say that the parents, the government, the community will have to pay for the cost of education. All we wish to emphasize is that we don't deny a child access to education because he himself cannot directly contribute to the cost. That is on per capita basis.
From news reports on trends in educational development in the country, one critic said that the public education is in a mess. A cursory look at the Nigerian newspapers within the middle of February 1984 indicated fees back in Benue schools, Herald, February 14, 1984, pupils to pay in Bendel, Herald, February 15, 1984, fees back in schools, Tribune, February 19, 1984, no free education in Ondo, Tribune, February 22, 1984. The Guardian of February 15, 1984 reported that Alhaji Ibrahim Abdullahi, the Minister of Education under General Buhari's administration, has declared that any state wishing to operate free education could go ahead, provided such state has the resources to do so. It has even been earlier reported that the Gongola state government would charge school fees with retroactive effect. According to the Benue State Military Governor, Brigadier Jeremiah Husseini, as from the third term of the 1983-84 school year, parents are to pay 5 naira per term per pupil in primary schools, while parents of those in post-primary institutions will pay 30 naira per term per student. Mr. Shola Mike, the president of the Student Union for the 1983-84 academic year at the University of Ilorin, Kwara State, was of the opinion that if all the states that constituted the former Western region enjoyed universal free primary education in 1955, when the nation's resources were far less than what are there now, then Nigeria can still afford to fund free education at all levels. He spoke further.
The former civilian administration, in spite of its failures, there were still some governments, even though you might call it push-foot efforts, at making sure that education is a right and not a privilege for the citizens of this country. And it does appear to us that if any country is really serious about its growth, technologically or otherwise, it has to realize that the issue of education is paramount. And on the issue of the possibility of a free education, we believe our country can finance this free education in this country. And we also believe that granting some sense of seriousness, this can be done in not too long future. We say this because when we juxtapose the Nigerian nation with some other so-called underdeveloped nations, or is it the third world nations we want to compare it with now? Because we don't want to give a funny comparison, say, with developed industrial nations like the United States, but we want to talk specifically of third world nations like Cuba. We find out that given even the little, which is less than us, natural and human resources, these countries are able to finance free education. And how are they been able to do this? It's simply because the economy of such countries lie in the hands of the nationals and not as we have it in Nigeria. We see the issue of the possibility of free education in this country as being concurrently linked with arresting the drift of this nation, the sale of this nation to the monopolies. I'm talking of the Western Shylocks that constitute themselves into all these transnational companies. You find out that the economy of this country is not in the hands of Nigerians, or Nigeria for that matter. And we believe that people who are economically enslaved can never be politically free. And when you are not politically free, culturally you are dependent too. And of course, education lies within the realm of culture. And this is why there is this serious gross, level of dependence on a level of education. And this is why we are giving a very strong plea to the government to consider this issue as being serious.
On Tuesday, 27th of March 1984, almost all the newspapers carried Major General Buhari's plea to Nigerians to aid education. Major General Buhari made the appeal in a discussion with an 11-man NLC delegation at the Dotun Barracks in Lagos on Monday the 26th. He added that primary education in some of the states of the Federation is dead, and that the nation is bankrupt with no silver lining yet on the horizon. So, if the economic situation in the country is that bad, and free education is to take place as some states did during the 1979-83 civilian rule, what therefore could be the economic implication of this trend for the country? Over now to Dr. Deji Popola of the University of Lagos.
Now our economic situation is such that it cannot contain such a giant financial program. We cannot contain it at this point in time because, one, there are other pressing national development programs that have to compete for financial allocations. And if we cannot meet our food requirements, if we cannot cultivate the land to produce, locally produce, food for the masses of the people, how can we talk of a sound, how can we then talk of the luxury of free educational system when in fact we cannot feed and clothe the masses of this nation? And therefore my position is that in order to avert some crisis, we should look logically, pragmatically at those policies and gradually introduce some dimensions of individual responsibility.
Professor E.A. Yoloye came up with ways through which funds could be generated for a free education program.
I don't think if we depend on the present sources of income alone, the government by and large depends on the revenue from oil and what little it gets from taxation. But if you go back to the way the voluntary agencies operated, I notice these days many states are saying we want to hand the schools back to the voluntary agencies because they ran it in the past. But if they go back into history and look at how those voluntary agencies ran the schools, what they were doing was they were mobilizing the communities. It was the communities paying for the schools. They got people to render free service. They got them to make contributions. They did the buildings by direct labor. People give freely of their time and so on. And so it was not that the voluntary agencies had a pot of money somewhere which they were dishing out. It was their ability to mobilize the resources of the community and redistribute it so that everybody has a share. And I think that is what the government ought to be thinking about. Finding ways of mobilizing communities. It's not everybody who will pay, but there are people who are capable of paying a substantial amount towards education if the mechanism is appropriately organized. Communities are interested in their children having education. They are prepared to sacrifice something for it. They are prepared to do it on a community basis rather than on an individual basis. In other words, if you get the entire community to say, okay, we want you to put up so many classrooms for secondary education for children in your area, I doubt that there will be many communities that will refuse to do it. Yet that would not enter into the usual annual revenue of the country. It will not be reckoned among that 10 million. But it is taking off part of the load of education. And I think if communities are mobilized in this way, if levies are put on certain luxury items, which again I know some of the UPN states did, if you are rich enough to drink 10 bottles of beer a day, I mean, it shouldn't be too much for you to pay a levy of 10 kobo on each bottle. In fact, I think the levy was much less than that. It's something like 2 kobo or something like that. The people who are enjoying these luxuries hardly notice it. And yet, when you think of the number of bottles of beer that are consumed in this country, and if you put an education levy of say 2 kobo per bottle of beer, you would be surprised how much you raise through that particular source. And there are several other items which are essentially things that are sought by the rich, not by the poor people. And if you can levy taxes on those things and collect them into a special pool, which you say this is for the purpose of education. So my feeling is that the governments have not sufficiently explored alternative avenues of raising funds. This is not to say that free education will not cost much. All I'm saying is that if they sit down and simply think, oh, our annual revenue is only 10 billion, education will cost 6 billion, therefore we cannot do it. I don't think it's a sufficiently positive approach to the problem.
Professor Awokoya, Dr. Deji Popola, and Professor Olutola not only supported Professor Yoloye's view, they also had this to say.
There can be an insurance scheme where people can go to university education and pay when they get qualified, because they're going to get some benefits for it. The thing can be expended over a number of years. It's an investment in their future. That is the extent to which I think you can make things free, highly subsidized by government, and yet allowing people with aptitude and so on to get all the best they want.
I think the government can evolve a taxing system or a taxing policy where every adult, every working adult is made to pay, in addition to the normal poll tax, some naira, few nairas, and the few naira will be enough to defray some of the expenses involved in education.
Also, at the primary and secondary school level, parents, business enterprises should be encouraged to participate. Indeed, there is nothing stopping parents from contributing, from establishing schools, private schools. Capitalist systems all over the world have private schools where they send their own children, where the children of the nobles go. But what we are primarily concerned is public education. We are concerned with children from poor families that cannot go into private institutions. Government should ensure that such children are well catered for, and that their own parents, the parents of these students also, have some form of contribution through PTA or voluntary collections in money and in kind to support the schools. These are ways of financing education.
Parents too were contacted as to how free education should be implemented. They had this to say.
In as much as I support free education, I would suggest that the government makes it a kind of 50% share, or about say 25%. The parents too should strive to contribute and take a bit of the responsibility of their children, since they brought these children into the world.
I'm Mrs. Makinde. I think the tuition should be the tuition alone should be borne by the government, while the buying of the books and all other expenses should be borne by the parents. And to make, to get the good quality we want from education, I don't think it shouldn't be left to the government alone. The parents just have to contribute something.
Perhaps after 24 years of emancipation from colonial domination, one would expect that Nigeria, if nothing else, ought to have successfully laid the foundation for a greater tomorrow. However, the story is too known to even primary school leavers that Nigeria remains in the wood when classical appraisal for either physical, structural, social and political developments are applied. When one looks at the general backwardness of Nigeria in any field that has to do with technology and industrialization, one would agree that the only first sane way out was the control of the nation's economy, which is at present being convicted to the mercy of international monopoly or oligopoly of twin brother. World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. It has been argued that our dilapidated economy cannot support free education at all levels. Educationists have argued that most of the changes in Nigeria are the products of school education, otherwise known as Western education. The acceptance of the 6334 Western education by Nigerians demands a new orientation in the country's socio-economic life. If Nigeria as a nation is to participate effectively in the modern world of technology, it has to develop economically and technologically. Sound education is the instrument of that development. There are certain imperatives for education, the first of which is that it should not be allowed to be separated from the society in which it operates. It was, however, observed that there is a gap between what the schools produce and what Nigerian society needs. Such a situation makes the present education in Nigeria basically dysfunctional, as it fails to integrate the educational effort with a fully planned development. The fate of the national policy on education is still very much in the balance. The chances are that it will be implemented for the most part, but its form will be modified considerably by political, economic, and social factors.